Hello, welcome to vlog number 12, the last vlog. This week we are asked to read chapters 10 and 14 of the Rhetorical Act, as well as chapter 2 of Reading Pop Culture. So to start off, I'm going to talk about chapter 10 of the Rhetorical Act, then I'm going to shift into the main readings of chapter 2 of Reading Pop Culture, and then I'm going to shift back to the Rhetorical Act, chapter 14, and then transition to the final paired essays of chapter 2. So to begin, chapter 10 of the Rhetorical Act is titled Opportunities and Challenges Arising from the Rhetor. So to start off, the book talks about the roles we establish, whether real or virtual, and how they're expanded. They're either expanded or constricted in peer groups. And we're all a part of the process by which we develop a vast array of possibilities. So we make sense of others, and we make sense of others by adopting roles in society. And to understand critical analysis, one must identify the roles adopted by the rhetor who attempts to influence others. So, for example, the book talks about Kennedy, and Kennedy takes on a presidential candidate. He takes on the role of a presidential candidate in his Indianapolis speech. And then ultimately, in the end, he decides to switch his role into a eulogist as he commemorates Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. So discussing more about roles, the persona of a given rhetor will reflect position, occasion, specific purpose, and relationship to the audience, as well as the influence on the audience. So we can see this through ethos, which is the credibility, also known as the distinctive culture of an ethnic group, and the ethos of an individual depends on how well they reflect the qualities valued in that culture. So discussing more about ethos, it's one of the three paths of persuasion, with the other two being logos and pathos. It's the character of the rhetor. The way a rhetor mirrors qualities, values by a particular culture or group, and it's the attitude members of an audience have towards the rhetor. The next thing we're going to talk about is attitudes towards the rhetor prior to the rhetorical act, and it can originate in 5 areas: the rhetor's reputation, the rhetor's appearance, how the real rhetor is introduced to the audience, the context in which the rhetorical act occurs, and lastly, the occasion of the rhetorical act. Lastly, from chapter 10, we discussed how ethos is multidimensional and it can be affected by 4 factors. Authoritativeness, which is when one must be perceived as informed, an expert, qualified, intelligent, and reliable. There's trustworthiness, which means having moral excellence. There's dynamism, which is the attitude towards the rhetor and how it's affected by the degree to which they are empathetic, aggressive, forceful, bold, active, and energetic. And lastly, there's identification, which is the perceived similarity between the rhetor and the audience. And with identification, there's 2 subgroups. So there's social power, which is the rhetor's potential for social influence, and there is participation by the audience. That was pretty much all that was discussed in chapter 10 of the Rhetorical Act. So let's move on to chapter 2 of Reading Pop Culture, which is titled Identity. Where do we discover ourselves in pop culture? So, just discussing the main readings of this chapter, I would like to start off with a quote on page 82 that states, "America has long tried to reconcile the paradoxes and tensions implicit in the notion of personal, social, and national identity. Motto e pluribus unum," which means out of many one, to the metaphor of a melting pot in which all identities would be dissolved, reconstituted, and unified in a transcendent American ideal. So essentially, our identity, whether that be racial, ethnic, gender, sexual, online, or offline, they're all invariably social, and they all have public implications that are bound to our popular culture aesthetics and technology as well. So to start off, in Armstrong's An Argument for Being a Poser, Armstrong narrates his childhood experience as a dabbler amongst punks and posers, and he ultimately argues that committing to one true subgenre is less important than the process of exploring multiple communities, subcultures, and identities. So essentially here, Armstrong is saying, don't just explore one culture or identity. Go ahead and explore multiple personas, cultures, subcultures, and you can identify with more than one, and that is perfectly okay. Next, in Cepeda's The N-Word is Flourishing Among Generation Hip Hop Latinos, Why We Should Care Now, Cepeda explores the meaning of this particularly racial slur within its ethnic subculture, specifically saying that there is a connection between the use of this slur within the Latino community, especially in the New York City area of like the Bronx, for example, saying that how Latinos were also discriminated against, and there's a connection there, and whether it should be used or not. And that debate is widely argued within this article. Next, in The End of White America, Sue analyzes the past, present, and the future of real America and whiteness, exploring pop culture's The Great Gatsby and comparing it to reflections of Sean P. Diddy Combs. Up next, Gladwell's The Sports Taboo. It focuses on the interrelationships of genetics, race, and sports athleticism. Just comparing how, like we said, how identity is reflected in sports, whether that be race, gender, sexual identity. And lastly, within Boyd's Impression Management in a Networked Setting, Boyd considers the challenges of identity construction and impression management within contemporary adolescents and young adults who must navigate these issues, all while under constant surveillance of newer technologies. So ultimately, from all 5 of those readings, whether it be our racial, ethnic, gender, sexual, online, offline identity, from exploring multiple identities as suggested within Armstrong's An Argument for Being a Poser, or whether it's examining the interrelationships of genetics and race within sports, such as mentioned in Gladwell's The Sports Taboo, or whether it be the frequent use of the N-word as a form of solidarity within the Latino oppression within Cepeda's The N-word is flourishing among Generation Hip-Hop Latinos. Why should we care now? Whether as any types of those reflections, identity is inextricably bound to our popular culture aesthetics, and we can construct our personas based upon this experience. Next up, to talk about Chapter 14 of the Rhetorical Act, which is titled Understanding the Occasion. The textbook talks about how it is important for critics to understand the occasions that trigger well-defined expectations. And it talks about Aristotle a lot and how he defines 3 genres of rhetoric, one being deliberative rhetoric, which is dealing with future policy, or you're either dealing with expediency or inexpediency, or you're dealing with practicality or impracticality issues. The next one being forensic rhetoric, which is dealing with criminal charges and punishments for past behavior, so you're either dealing with justice or dealing with injustice. And the third being ceremonial or epidetic rhetoric, which is dealing with a person, place, or an idea in the present. So you're either dealing with praise or with blame. And the book gives many examples of this through inaugural addresses and eulogies especially. So, some rhetorical acts violate audience expectations in order to agitate more powerfully for a cause, which jolts audiences out of their complacency and receive the media. And the apologetic genre, or apologia as Aristotle called it, is what is labeled as rhetoric self-defense, and it shares features from all 3 classical genres. So, for example, as in forensic discourse, apologists must ask for revised judgments of their past actions. As in deliberative discourse, apologists must wrest argumentative control over the alleged indeed from the hands of their accusers if they wish to recover politically or economically. As in epideitic discourse, apologists engage in image repair, which is seeking to restore their honor by treating questions of value in front of their observers who exercise their voyeuristic tendencies in what is described as a spectacle of rhetorical grace under fire. And lastly, in regards to the elements of descriptive analysis, we see apologia as reflected as a multifaceted heritage. So in the epideitic discourse, they aim to alter perception. The forensic discourse, it aims to explain. And lastly, the deliberative discourse, it aims to formulate belief. And like I said, lastly, we will be talking about the paired essays in Chapter 2, Reading Pop Culture. And the paired readings considering identity through gender roles and sexual identity as how it reflects through pop culture. So first, in Levi's Woman and the Rise of Raunch Culture, Levi explains that the social and the cultural pressures that encourage liberated women to embrace a tawdry, tardy, cartoon-like version of female sexuality. All while doing this, Levi argues that the raunchy and the liberated are not synonymous. And she asks, how is resurrecting every stereotype of female sexuality that feminism endeavored to banish good for women? Why is labeling to look like Pamela Anderson empowering? And how is imitating a stripper or porn star, a woman whose job is to imitate arousal in the first place, going to render us sexually liberated? That quote is on page 131. And analyzing these sexually charged aesthetics of pop culture, such as Charlie's Angels and Playboy, Levi claims that playing the objectifying and misogynistic role of female stereotypes should not be deemed as empowering, but rather raunchy, as it is not a reflection of how far we've come, but a reflection of how far we have left to go. And that quote is also on page 131. Lastly, within Cole's Pop Culture's Transgender Moment, Cole argues that the emergence of the complex transgender characters, such as in series Transparent or Orange is the New Black, there's a groundbreaking shift as confined to online space rather than traditional media. So, Cole quotes Matt Cain, which is GLAAD Director of Entertainment Media, and Matt Cain states that these shows, such as Transparent and Orange is the New Black, they reflect a very modern awareness of identity in our culture and the challenges of it, but also the unexpected emotion and humor that can come out of it. That quote is on page 134. And this essay is just a more positive reinforcement of how this type of newly formed identity is being more represented nowadays. And that is all for vlog number 12. Thank you so much for listening.